Hello, and welcome to this episode of Data Unchained. I'm Molly Presley, your host, and I'm really excited to have a longtime colleague, really interesting industry leader joining me on today's podcast. Ari Berman is the CEO of a company called Bioteam and a longtime researcher, technologist in the life sciences space. Ari, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Molly. So good to be here with you.
Great to have you here. Would you start by telling us about you personally a bit? You have a really interesting, diverse background, and then a little bit about Bioteam as well.
Sure, happy to. I definitely have a very strange and diverse background. It's rooted both in science and technology. So I have a PhD in molecular biology and trained as a neuroscientist and did 15 years of laboratory research on the neuroscience of addiction, as well as in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And then I spent another 5 years doing purely computational research, trying to take gene targets that we are discovered in model organisms and figure out the same targets in humans. And then at the same time, I've been designing, building, and operating supercomputers and high-performance computing environments for about 30 years. And everything in between, and basically designing and putting together IT infrastructures that support science. And so those two things came together very well in this company Bioteam that I joined in 2012 as a consultant. And that's exactly what we do. We sort of bridge the gap between science and IT, and try to make science go faster and so better supported by IT.
So tell us a little bit more for those who may be joining the show that aren't experts in IT. How does supercomputing and health of the human population come together?
There's a lot of data that's generated out there, basically, which is, I guess, why this is so apt for Data Unchained here. What's happened in the last, 15 or so years in life sciences and biomedical research is that the laboratory technology used to do research and analyze what might be going on in disease conditions or disease-like conditions, or just really to even understand basic biology, has really taken off. It's, we talk about Moore's law and, technology increasing at an exponential scale. The technology innovation in the laboratory has been basically cubic, such that it's almost straight up, so that the laboratory technology for a while was innovating on the order of months, where IT was on the order of years. And so the fascinating thing about that is that because that laboratory technology was changing so much, how could IT keep up with that, with refresh cycles that were in 3 to 5 years? And also at the very beginning, IT didn't even know they had to support science. So they were really supporting documents and printing and phone systems and desktop systems. And all of a sudden the scientists say, hey, I need a server. I need to use things. And so the supercomputing industry sort of swooped in. That's been around for a very long time, with lots of other sciences like, astronomy, high energy physics, simulation spaces, those sorts of things. But the life sciences industry sort of got into it, at least on a very sophisticated level, to start using large supercomputers or clusters as processing farms, basically. So that they could have what they needed. So complicated space, but
Thus your background, marrying the two technologies.
Basically.
So Bioteam's mission is increase the speed of scientific discovery by applying data strategies. There's a bit more to it than that, but I want to delve into this for this podcast and talk a little bit more about that. So when you think about how data is informing scientific discovery, and we're all in the middle of a world where health and human population health is forefront with the COVID pandemic and things that have been raging around the world in different countries even before COVID. How does data inform driving forward cures, driving forward things like mask mandates? How does this tie to the humans that listen to this show?
Surprisingly tightly, and in a way that most people probably wouldn't be aware of. the media and Twitter and those folks tend to distill many years long research projects from lots and lots of data down into 160 character soundbite and call that research. But the reality is, and COVID is a great example, the way data are generated and the way data are treated by, say, governments are very different across the world. And things like data privacy laws and in the United States, HIPAA is sort of the most known of that, and GDPR across Europe is another one that really takes data that's generated by from a human being that has that human being's information attached to it and limits its use to the country of origin, and sometimes even more tightly than that. What happened when COVID happened was suddenly the world had to figure out how to survive. So, if you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the top level of the human condition is self-actualization, in which rules like limiting data to a country can happen. We dropped all the way down to survival, and all the countries dropped that for COVID immediately. And what was really interesting is that the data for COVID started really to flow. It was things like sequencing data for what was this virus to even begin with. We had never seen it before. How did we figure out quickly how to generate vaccines? It's because the world collaborated on figuring out what it looked like and where we could make vaccines against, and what did it do? How did it bind to our cells? Those sorts of things. And so what's really interesting is the National Institutes of Health has collected something like 55 petabytes of COVID data, and that's a lot of data. And in collaboration with cloud providers and also using local and collaborative supercomputing groups, did things in a couple of weeks, like be able to generate the entire molecular structure of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and figure out that the spike protein is the important part of that. And that in the wild, the spike protein is covered in all these, glycan protein sugars that protect it from the immune system, and that made it so that your immune system couldn't really get a fix on that and generate antibodies against it. So the vaccines were developed as just the spike protein without that, so that your immune system could effectively attack it. And so there was a whole lot of really interesting data that affected that, and because the world needed to collaborate quickly on that in order to get us moving forward in this pandemic, which is still ongoing. The only reason we were able to do that was because of infrastructures to be able to support high quality, high speed, and highly collaborative analyses, and then the sharing of those results globally. So, things like mask mandates or masks are the same thing. Lots of interesting simulations. Computational fluid dynamics is the area that studies sort of how fluids or gases, sort of flow through air and through substances. And so, simulating masks and masks in conditions and understanding, if someone coughs, what does that look like in a room in various conditions? And they did all these different things. And just in the simulation space, it was clear that masks were helpful to reduce the spread. But there's also been a lot of empirical work there. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit.
You're touching on a few key trends that you and I have discussed, and the idea of the cultural shift of my data to our data, that there's been legislation, there's been organizations for IP reasons, all kinds of reasons that my data has been held tightly, and our data and sharing across the globe has really been a big advancement for scientists. And it seems like we need to figure out the standards and the legislation to make that something we can do. I think that's a really fascinating concept. And then as you start to talk a little bit more about the science of what you're doing, one of the other things we've talked about is that data is becoming more diverse. It's coming from, I think you mentioned, supercomputing, simulations, genomic sequencers, viral analysis, several things just in that conversation just now. Maybe talk a little bit about it for data to become really usable globally to the people who need it to make good decisions, to do research? Are there standards that are needed? Kind of what needs to happen with data to take this to the next level?
I'm so glad you asked that question. This is my soapbox this year. So the negative side of the whole COVID analytics is that the data came in a million different formats, and you can't just get a sequencing file and know what it is, right? It has to have a lot of metadata attached to it that describes where it came from, who did the work, what kind of sequencer was it done on, what was the sample type, how was it prepped, all these things. And then once you analyze it and start getting it into, the space of knowledge generation, you have to tag it with, what family did it belong to, and, those sorts of things. And what happened was the data came in almost countless different formats. And so to even start analyzing it, data scientists, data curators, bioinformaticians had to sit there and figure out how to bring those data into the same context. There's this concept called ETL, which is extract, transform, and load. And extracting the data, pulling it onto your system so that you can analyze it, and then transforming the data so that you can actually load it into analytics to actually gain knowledge from it. And in life sciences and biomedical space, there are standard formats. There's just 40 of them, and everyone thinks theirs is the best. And that's a big problem, because in order to look at data in larger contexts than just your research project or your collaborative project, you really need to spend a lot of time harmonizing those data. And this is a big problem across everything. And it could be just sequencing data even comes across. There's lots of different sequencer manufacturers, and they all have their different file formats, and they all have their different, sample prep formats. But now we're looking at extraordinarily diverse sets of data, like images. You step into an MRI machine, you get all the MRI data, which isn't actually an image. It's converted into an image for you to look at, but there's all sorts of really interesting stuff that comes from that. Microscope data that is looking at things like pathology. Do you have cancer? Is your liver cirrhosed? Do you have all these other potential conditions? Then with COVID, using newer technologies like cryo electron microscopy, which is a newer method of electron microscopy that allows you to look at the physical structure of something extremely microscopic, like down to the atoms, in a way that it's fixed in a lifelike condition. That's been hard to do, because you're basically aiming an electron laser at a thing and it evaporates before you really get to look at it. So, doing those types of analyses, it generates all these different interesting types of data that have no common context. And if you really want to pull it together to make good discoveries and make large data sets out of this to increase the power of the type of searches you're doing, there's a lot to it. It's a hard space.
So I think that's a really kind of interesting concept, that MRIs aren't actually images. They're a bunch of complex things and bits and bytes behind it that become an image. How does this work? So you think about analytics and deriving information that's conclusive results out of this data. Is it AI? Is it computers? Is it really smart scientists with PhDs who's looking at all this and drawing conclusions? How does that work?
That's a very complex question with a complex answer. And I'm not sure I know all of it. I can say that it's actually a mixture of all of those things. So, just sticking with the MRI for a second, that was, brilliant physics engineering that did that. That's using electromagnetic waves in a controlled environment to, basically see disruptions in an electromagnetic field across a tissue at various states, and being able to resolve that into what maybe caused that in different densities, and then turning that into an image or a set of absorbances or other things. Like, you can watch neurons activate, for instance, when someone's doing something, functional MRI. And so it was a mixture of what are we trying to do and how do we get there? And I think these layers of innovation come from past attempts to view things and how hard it was to do them. And then realizing that, these different types of data if you coalesce them in a way that helps answer specific questions that you're asking, so hypotheses in science, right? What is cancer, right? Cancer is actually very complex, 180 different subtypes of cancer at least, with all sorts of different etiologies. Some are virus forms, some we don't even know why they start. So there isn't a cure for cancer, right? And there never will be. So how do you treat cancer? That's sort of the question. And then how do you get down to what these things are on a molecular level? And then how do you, merge that with the system they're a part of, which is your body? The tumor or the cells don't exist in a vacuum. So if you're studying the cells themselves, you have to understand how they interact with the system. And so you need data for the system, and you need to understand the human history of the person that was attached to them, because not everyone's the same. And so that, this is getting towards, I guess, the panacea of what data can do for us if collected and analyzed correctly, which is sort of this area of precision medicine, where using these various analytics methods in a healthcare environment, we can pinpoint how to treat your condition the way you have it. So it's personalized medicine, but a lot more pinpointed, which ultimately would say, in an ideal world, there'd be no side effects from your treatment. It would only treat what we're aiming at, and it would actually be, curative or take care of the symptoms or stop the disease from progressing or whatever those things are. We're still a long way away from that, but we're getting there.
It's fascinating. I think that as we think about the progression and the types of folks who listen to this show, I mean, it's going to be people anywhere from the ones who make the supercomputers to the cloud companies, the ones who make servers who are in massive supply chain problems. I think that we think about kind of how do we help further these initiatives. Those of us who are not immersed in the life sciences space and the biotech space. I know there's a piece about infrastructure, about making data available globally to the people who can make the decisions. Kind of what is your guidance to the industry that maybe is on the periphery of your space?
So the industry is blocked by a number of things, and you named a lot of them. I think everyone has the intention to get there, but there's short-term problems like, how do I advance my career? How do I get funded for my research? How does my supercomputing center get its next set of funding so I can build the next supercomputer? How do the vendors that provide those computers and storage equipment and network equipment to build the supercomputers, how do they make money and how do they win that? And where does that go? So So let me back into the supercomputing space for a second, where in computing, the metrics that they are usually sold by is, what we call hero numbers, right? Which is, benchmarks against certain types of data flows. And, this does this many, fractional calculations per second, which is meaningless to an end user, to a scientist. It's like saying, my car gets 17 miles per gallon, and having that translate to how fast it goes, right? It's just not an equivalence that people can make. So I think where we are trying to push things is, what problem are you trying to solve, and what tools support that solution? And it could be cloud providers, it could be supercomputers, it could be you're building your own thing, it could be software, it could be any number of things. But if you think about the problem you're trying to solve and how the ecosystem of scientific computing can help support that, the question gets answered in a different way. And you really approach it more based on the outcomes you're trying to solve than let's build a shiny thing and see how that can help us.
That makes sense. So making all of this data available, driving some standards, continuing to give access as this data is created across different types of instruments. All these things are things I think probably, as we kind of close, that we can tie this up with. Anything else that you want to share with our audience about how BioTeam kind of steps into this, solving these solutions? I think people might be interested to hear that as well.
I think one of the things that we focus a lot on that is probably unusual is that, we talk about the technology, we talk about the science. The reality is that all of it is done by people. So culture is a huge part of the problem and a huge part of what needs to be changed here. So Bioteam, we sort of take a very holistic view of these things. We take a view of the technology, we take a view of the science, we take a view of the people that need to support it, and we try to work very collaboratively with our clients so that they can accomplish their mission, and so that all of those three parts of the triad can converge, so that we can help drive the industry forward in a way that helps make science easier to do, really. And the cultural part of that is huge. There's a lot of resistance, say, to some of the things that we've talked about, like common data standards. There's a ton of resistance in the field to do that because they're not necessarily incentivized to do that work, and it's hard. And changing how they're doing things will slow down their production. So it's got to be easy. It's got to be incentivized, and you really have to pay attention to the people and create a new culture around it. So that's really where Bioteam spends its time, and our expertise is in all of those spaces, so that we can drive it forward. And our bigger goal is simply to really drive science forward in a way that is supported by technology, so that humanity can continue to mature in a way that allows us to avoid things like COVID-19 in the future, and solve things like cancer, or at least parts of cancer, and just revisiting everything we said. And plus, it's just really fascinating stuff to look through.
It certainly is. Hey, Ari, thank you so much for joining this podcast. You've been a great guest, and we look forward to talking to you again, potentially in the future.
Thanks, Molly. Really appreciate the invite. This was fun.
Thanks for listening to Data Unchained, powered by Hammerspace. To learn more, visit hammerspace.com. If you have a guest you would like to hear on the show, email me at molly@hammerspace.com.